And welcome to another episode of the Turn Up For What podcast, talking your Houston Texans straight from the Great British Isles. The Texans are now the only winless team in the National Football League after going down 34-24 on Sunday NRG against the Chargers. It was another defeat, but it feels like a variation on a theme. Trying to put the content together seems a little bit repetitive, but to talk us through this week and try and help us out is a first-time guest. He's the co-host of the Killer Bees on ESPN 97.5, Mr. Jeremy Branham. Jeremy, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. Always enjoy talking about the Texans and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. I think it kind of feels very similar to last season again. And every week this year seems a bit like that. But Lovey admitted a little bit reluctantly, as a man who's very positive in front of the media at his pressers, but he did say we're not a good football team right now. 4 games in, how do you sort of agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Lovey. He would know more than us, and willing to admit it. I thought that was interesting because he has been positive. He's talked about being close. The tie and the first week of the season too. Like I wonder if he goes back and makes a decision on fourth down to punt for a tie a little bit differently if he didn't think he was going to be a good football team in 4 weeks. So it's kind of interesting that he was willing to admit that. I agree with it though. Like you mentioned in the opening, they're the only winless team in the entire league. I didn't have a whole lot of expectations for them at the start of the season, and I would have never predicted 0-3-1 because of the tie, but they're not far off of what I thought they were going to be through 4 games.
Yeah, I think that the part of that quote that left out there was he said we're not a good football team yet.
Right.
What do you think is the difference between this team winning and losing right now? What's the main? We'll get into some of the more detail, but just from a grander, sort of broader view, where do you? What's the yet part? What do they need to fix? What can they coach up? What's actually fixable? What's feasible?
Yeah. See, I think there's 2 ways to look at that. If I'm looking at it from his point of view, and I'm looking at not yet, it's the young players because you're not trading for anybody really. Nick Caserio is not going to trade future picks to help this year's roster. That would be foolish. There's young players on this team that you would expect to get better. I don't think Davis Mills has played good football. I think Davis Mills can be better. You can say that you think Davis Mills can be better while also not thinking Davis Mills is the future. I think Davis Mills has been better the last 2 games. I would expect him to be better at some point throughout the rest of the year. Dameon Pierce is kind of coming into his own right. He's a rookie that you would expect to get better, although you would take the game he had against the Chargers every day of every week in the NFL. Defensively, their best players are defensively, I think. You spend the number 3 pick on Derek Stingley Jr., you're expecting him to be one of your more talented players. You select Jalen Petrie early in the second round, you expect him to be one of your more talented players, and I think that they will be. And as rookies play more games, they get better, right? You expect them to be better in game 14 than game 4. So I think you can see some development there. But overall, in terms of do I think the Texans are going to be much better in week 14 as now? I don't see it. I just don't see the talent on this roster being there. I think it's a more talented roster than last year, but relative to the NFL, it's worst roster in the NFL.
Yeah, I think it's a fine balance, isn't it? Because like you said, it's like there's a lot of good storylines in there of rookie guys who are developing. You can see that, but it's perhaps a more promising team, but more prone to making mistakes. And I think you saw that particularly on those 2 Eckler runs for touchdowns, getting beat by the same play, linebackers running into each other on that Mike Evans big separation where he got 50-plus yards, ran right across the formation. I think Wallow and might be Reeves maybe literally ran into each other. Didn't know if it was a run, didn't know if it was a pass. And I think there's a lot of, I suppose there's a lot of kind of, it's a new coaching staff, but I do think the players are more promising, Jeremy. But I go back to the viewpoint of I don't know if they're better coached this year or not this year. I can't make my mind up. I know it's still early and you can't write the book after 4 weeks, but there's still a 17-game slate to play. But yeah, I think when I saw that play back today, various times just not setting setting your in your rush lanes, leaving them wide open. Simple draw play, 22-yard touchdown for Eckler. It seemed to compound against a team who can't run the ball previously, last year and this year, then run it on you very easily. And I think when it comes down to that, like, guys get pushed around up front, overly focused on gap shooting, not necessarily holding their gaps at the point of attack and being aware of what kind of play is, what the run is. It feels a little bit disjointed, and the irony is the strength is the defense, absolutely. But when you're coughing up 280 yards on the ground last week, when you're letting a guy didn't have a touchdown for a long time, come back in and score 3 and make it look very easy at times, make their offensive line look really good as well. Just lost our left tackle. Slayer comes in makes his debut, 6th-round pick, guy that wasn't overly that highly rated. All look like really good players against the Texans, and I think some of that for me boils down to coaching.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a fair way to look at it. And defensively, like offensively, you can compare last year to this year, and they have two different coordinators, right? Like Pep Hamilton came back, but it's a much different offensive system than they were running last year. So you can look at it offensively and see how it compares, and it's an apple and oranges comparison to where it was a year ago to where it is now. But defensively, you still have Lovie Smith as the defense coordinator. He was elevated to the head coach, but he's made it very clear that he's capable of calling plays as the head coach defensively. It is still very much his defense. We were talking about that on the show today. At what point does Lovie Smith get some blame? And Lovie Smith's an upgrade from a head coach point of view on Sundays, game management than David Culley. I would argue that's not a very high bar, though. And Lovie Smith has had a couple of instances where his game management has been questioned. The tie. I know we've talked about personnel packages on our show. 4th and 1 with Rex Burkhead. Now, is that Pep Hamilton? Is it Lovie? You can have that argument, but Lovey's defense wasn't good last year statistically. They're in the bottom of the league. They're currently bottom of the league. So, I don't disagree with you. I think it's a combination of both. I think it's fair to ask the question if the game has passed Lovey by. He hasn't had a great defense in a really long time in the NFL. Now, his personnel is not great, but I think it's a combination of both. I think the personnel is not good, and the coaching right now has been. I was somewhat impressed with him the first 3 weeks, or the first 2 weeks, but then they got ran all over by Chicago, who's a one-dimensional team and doesn't trust Fields to throw the football. And then this past week, granted, it was the best offense that they were playing so far this year with the Chargers, but they put up huge offensive numbers.
Yeah, just take out the defense for a bit. How do they float this for the rest of the year? Because ultimately, if they don't get turnovers, things go south pretty quickly. You got linebackers who not a single one of them can play a damn really in this league, and you're hoping Christian Harris comes back and makes that unit look a little bit better. But for all the talk of Garrett Wallow, looked lost out there at times. I think he's limited to specialties, but I thought that watching him at TCU. I hope I'm proved wrong. You've got Reeves Maben out there. You got Blake Cashman dropping an interception really early in the game. He's coming. Peter Lewis is on IR. Like, that position was a mess, and a lot of people in training camp talked about that as a strength. And it perplexed me at the time, Jeremy, reading that and seeing that, because I just thought, well, on paper I can't see how any of these guys are good. Christian Kirksey his only strength is downhill. A defense that's coached by Lovie's son, a pass rush that was completely neutralised this week, no turnovers. I struggle to see how they're going to survive the rest of the season, in the hope that we would progress from last year's blowouts.
I don't see it either. You alluded to the 4-man rush that Lovie doesn't like to blitz a whole lot. He wants to create pressure with his 4 down linemen, and like you mentioned, there wasn't a whole lot of pressure. They had 1 sack. I don't remember many hurries. Now you have to credit Herbert. He can get rid of the football. He knows where to go based on what he's seeing defensively. I don't see it either. The linebacking unit's the worst position group on this team, and that includes the quarterback position. Christian Harris, again, he's a rookie. How much do you want to count on him? Like, I don't think Christian Harris is going to be a great football player like that. I think we'll see the flashes. I think we'll see the talent, like we've seen it with Stingley, like we've seen it with Petrie, yet he was drafted after those guys. Now, it's fair to say he is immediately going to be their most talented linebacker, but he's not going to be playing excellent football. That's a huge area of weakness, and especially for a Lovie defense. I think Lovie relies on his linebackers quite a bit, and he doesn't have the personnel to get excellent results from the style of defense he's wanting to run.
Yeah, I don't think Christian Harris is going to give you, probably the knock against him or why he kind of dropped a little bit was his concerns, converted safety, concerns against the run. And I think it's probably time as well, Jerry, to kind of open up the conversation about Roy Lopez is not playing well up front. He's getting turned. He's consistently got his back to the play. It's happened far too many times this year. There was a couple of times later in the game he made some plays. I think Malik Collins is not warranted that deal. And I think that was always the concern when a guy got paid before his form dip. You pay him here. I know he's kind of holding a knee injury, but
Yeah.
there was a play where he got into the backfield, starts chasing the running back, and the ball is still in Herbert's hands at the time. So those two guys, I think, particularly have regressed. Certainly, have been manhandled at the point of the attack. And if you just take a still frame every time a team runs the ball, it's pinball stuff. And I think Lovey's going to have to, at some point, think, well, actually, you're not going to be able to get pressure. It was I think there was 2 hits, 1 sack on Herbert against a line that's definitely not a strength, definitely not an upper tier unit. But just rushing the 4 with the guys we have, when Jerry Hughes is your best guy, that in no circumstance should a 33-year-old rusher be a positive for you, particularly when you're rebuilding. Jonathan Grenard's been posted missing this season, I think, as well. I think, I certainly think, and I said that a lot. I didn't think his sacks were high quality, beating men around the edge, bending, getting low underneath tackles or beating them with a array of hand fighting moves. It was more effort and a bit of push-pull moves. So I think when you add all that together, it's a bit of a sorry mix, those front 4 guys. When you need that to get home consistently, this defense just seems to completely fall down. And I don't know who gets better, and I don't know where the production will come from.
It's going to have to come from coaching, and that's something that's a fear. I've been surprised with Grenard specifically. I thought his work, I thought his production would be a lot better than it's been. But what's really surprising to me is his snap counts. His snap counts are just roughly above 50% the last 2 games, which you're in a rebuild. John Grenard's in his 3rd year. You thought he might take a step up. However, he's getting the sacks to get to double digits, at least flirt with double digit sacks. And Rasheem Green's playing just as much as he is. Jerry Hughes is playing more than he is. And I understand that you want, a rotation there, keep bodies fresh. But Grenard's supposed to be your best player, and he hadn't been. That's a bit alarming to me in terms of counting on John Grenard to be a foundational piece of the rebuild. You're right about Malik Collins. I think Casario's been pretty good at finding players on this 53 that would be good finds for winning teams. Like Malik Collins last year would have been a good find if you had a playoff type roster, and he's an added piece. Same thing with Jerry Hughes. I mean, what contender wouldn't like to have Jerry Hughes as their 3rd defensive end? I think Casario's done good there, which is encouraging when the Texans get back to being a playoff contender. Encouraging if Nick Caserio's around for that playoff contender. Roy Lopez, last year he was a nice player, but he was kind of a niche player, right? Being an every down defensive tackle in the NFL, I wasn't sure if he was ever going to be that guy. Now, it's worth to give it a shot. It's worth to see. In a lot of ways this year is kind of, you're learning a lot about a lot of guys. You're learning to see if they can be every down players. Like we spend a lot of time talking about Davis Mills because quarterback's a very popular position in the NFL. But guys like Roy Lopez, you're finding out about him. Guys like John Grenard, can you count on him to be your best defensive end? So there's to me, 2022 is all about answering the questions that you have. Roy Lopez, after a rookie year, you want to see if he can be a steal in the 6th round. John Grenard, you want to see if he can be, I don't know if I was ever going to call him an elite defensive end, but maybe like a tier 2, tier 3 defensive end that you can rely on to get 10 sacks a game. And he hasn't shown that. You're right that Jerry Hughes is your best defensive end is a little troublesome for a rebuilding team. He's a much better fit for a team that has playoff, level defense. The front 7, Lovey's talked about a lot. Especially last week against Chicago, it's kind of a tell of 2 different games, right? Chicago, they just ran 280 yards, and then yesterday Justin Herbert had a huge game. But both kind of come down to the front 7, not getting pressure yesterday, and then not being able the inability to stop the run, really all year, but it was really on display against Chicago.
Yeah, and I just think when your 2 defensive tackles are just getting turned around or shooting past the ball, the second it's handed off, they're 3 yards in the backfield. And they're not helping the run at that point. I think And I know that's part of the scheme and that's the style, but I think it goes back to that whole point of, people are faster, linemen are more athletic, they can get up the field quicker. And I think, yeah, it just goes back to that point. Has this scheme been eroded with time in the way that, players are more athletic, schemes are more intricate? And I think at times it looks dated. I think Mario Addison coming back could potentially be your best pass rusher. Who that goes out, I don't know. I think Rasheem Green's been serviceable.
Yeah.
He's probably been the best out of a bad bunch, I would say. I think it was Jerry Hughes obviously filled the stat column, but he's going to have up and downs at his age of the physical wear and tear that he's had. So maybe Addison comes back in off IR now that this week. We'll wait and see how that develops. But I suppose the big one is Davis Mills, and you never get away from talking about it. You touched upon it there. Did this week's performance change anything of your view of Davis?
No, it didn't. I think for the first time in 2022, he showed the ability that he can make big time NFL throws. But we saw that last year. There was back-to-back plays on the touchdown drive. I think it was in the fourth quarter. Quick go route. Nico Collins dropped it into a bucket, and that was whenever the Chargers were playing back in coverage too. They were trying to keep everything in front of them. So I thought that was a really good throw. And on the very next snap, he hits Brandon Cooks on a deep post for the touchdown. So we saw two high-level NFL throws from Davis Mills. I thought Davis Mills already had that in the bag. We saw it last year. Now, we haven't seen it a whole lot in 2022, so that's somewhat encouraging. But there's still so many inconsistencies, and you can point to the fact that he hasn't played a lot. I understand that. But to me, the biggest attribute for a quarterback is decision making. I think you have to be a good decision maker. You look at all the great quarterbacks, and they all make really good decisions. I mean, Tom Brady, he's obviously the pinnacle at the position, but great decision maker. Aaron Rodgers, great decision maker. Some of the younger quarterbacks who are really good don't have that level of decision making, like a Pat Mahomes, a Josh Allen. Sometimes they can get into trouble. Herbert, I think, is a really good decision maker. So there's so many plays where Davis Mills, you go back and you watch them where you're like, what was he thinking on this play? He had Pharaoh Brown here. He had Nico Collins here. You can look at, I would say almost 3/4 of his pass attempts this year, and you're kind of wondering, what are you seeing in the defense? Why are you going here with the ball? Why aren't you getting rid of it sooner? Why are you holding on to it too long? And I think it's a little bit more than the inexperience. I just don't know if he's capable of playing the position at a high level. My biggest thing, too, with quarterbacks, like Davis Mills showed us 2 high-level NFL throws. Every backup quarterback in the NFL is capable of making 2 high-level NFL throws. These are the top 64 quarterbacks in the entire world. I mean, if you just take the 2 deep from the quarterback position of every NFL team, you're looking at 64 quarterbacks who are the very best in the entire world. So it's not so much about being able to show flashes. It's about your bar and your floor is higher than everybody else's. It's consistent play. It's consistent quality decision making. It's consistently being accurate with the football. It's consistently being on time. And I just don't see it in Davis Mills. I've really never seen it. He showed more flashes at the end of last year than he has this season. But I hate calling it. And look, I'm excited to still see the rest of the year of Davis Mills. I really am. Even though I'm really looking forward to some of these college quarterbacks. Like, I don't want Davis Mills to get benched. He needs to play every game. And I hope he proves me wrong. I hope at the end of the year where it was like, wow, that was great progression and great development from Davis Mills. But I can't really believe it. I just can't convince myself to buy it because I haven't seen it enough.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's the point. I think a lot of fans will hold on to that 6-play drive. Okay, it got up and running in the fourth quarter. The first time they've done that this year, they got the screen pass out to Rex Burkhead, ironically, on a 3rd and 6. Got there, then it was 2 throws, and you were in the end zone. You think, well, yeah, this is what it's meant to look like, but that's just so infrequent, and it's not consistent enough to the point where, yeah, you're right. I mean, any guy on a roster, Chase Daniels is sitting on the side there, 13 years in the league. He could do that at some point as well. He may not now, but there's guys that are staying in the league, and that's what keeps them in this league. And I think you go from having flashes when you first get in a side to come and play some ball, and then it very quickly becomes about consistency. And I think the decision making point you touched on there, Jim, it was bang on, because I was watching back today. At the end of the second half, they're trying to drive. It's the second time they get the ball back after the 75-yard touchdown from Damian Pierce, and there's three plays back to back where he just picks the wrong pass. There's one where he guns it high at Pierce from when Nico was coming over the middle. There's one where Brandon Cooks is wide open. He sails a ball, lands out of bounds to Chris Moore. And just small instances like that add up very, very quickly at this level, and it becomes too insurmountable to have a cohesive and consistent offense that can move the ball. And that's why you end up being 21 points down at home. And I think that's the issue with Davis, and I think he's proven to this point now in this season that you can't be that inconsistent. You can't lack the necessary decision-making skills when you've only got 1.5 seconds to pick your check down. And even when it is the check down's the right option, he's not taking it. First half was all check down. Let it loose a little bit. Got it moving. But I think in the big play that turned this was the worst play call of the day, Jeremy, was when they got the ball back. DeAndre Carter will fumble the ball. We all know that. We've seen it far too many times. They gave you a great chance to go and take a 1-point lead. And when it came to, I know Kenyon Green blew up his pass protection and he didn't have a great day, Kenyon. So it wasn't all his fault. But after those two big time throws, you think, right, go and do it again. That's where the good guys come in and they turn the screw, they flip the switch. And you end up kicking the field goal. And I think after that point, everybody knew that was all she wrote.
Yeah, I've called him on my show a game manager, not a game winner. I think that's a perfect illustration of it. This is your opportunity to go put a team on your back and win a game. And I understand that the Texans have a lot of holes other than the quarterback position. I mean, Pep Hamilton has had some questionable play calling. I think it's fair to question him. The offensive line, in my opinion, had their worst game yesterday, especially in pass protection. Run protection was fine, but pass protection not very good. And other than Brandon Cooks, who really hasn't been good this year, he had a good game against the Chargers, but his first 3 games was not playing like a top receiver on an NFL team. And then after that, you don't have a whole lot from a weapon point of view. The weaponry is not great for Davis Mills. But any really good quarterback you feel can win any game with whoever he's got. Any really good quarterback you feel is a playoff contending team with any team he has. Even when Deshaun Watson and the Texans were terrible in his last year with the Texans and they only won 4 games, you went into that season thinking they were playoff caliber. A debacle of a year, Bill O'Brien got fired, we know the story, but you still go into every game thinking Deshaun Watson's capable of winning a game for you. In terms, I think sometimes too that like you can escape poor decision making as a quarterback and still show flashes of being pretty good. Like Kyler Murray, I don't think is a very good decision maker. I think it's pretty well documented. But Kyler Murray has elite traits that sometimes can overcome that decision making. Right? He's an incredible scrambler. He's really fast. He's got a cannon for an arm. He's got one of the better arms, I think, in the entire league. But he's a poor decision maker. So we see all the bells and whistles with Kyler Murray, and we think he's going to be a great quarterback. And then we look at his decision making, and it's not so good. But a lot of times all of his talent can overcome that decision making, and he still looks like a potential top 10 quarterback. Davis Mills, I don't think, he doesn't have his best attribute needs to be his decision making. His arm's good enough to be in the NFL. I'm not somebody who thinks that a quarterback needs a cannon. You don't. You can win without a cannon. We've seen that a lot. But you have to be really accurate with the football. His strength is not his accuracy, which is a problem. He's mobile enough, but he's not incredibly mobile. He's not a huge athlete. He's not going to beat you up too much scrambling the football. So a quarterback like Davis Mills, who doesn't really have one quality that stands out more than anything else, has to be his decision making. Tom Brady's best quality is his decision making. His best quality is his footwork in the pocket. Not a great athlete, can't run, doesn't have a cannon for an arm, but is very accurate, great decision maker, and has great footwork in the pocket. So if Mills is going to succeed in the NFL, footwork in the pocket has to get better. His accuracy has to get better, which is scary because a lot of times accuracy doesn't improve. But decision-making needs to be his best quality, and right now it could potentially be his worst.
Yeah. And where do you think Pep was left in all this? Because, I mean, kind of the similar scenario to Lovey, it was kind of blinded by a sense of professionalism or knew that was perhaps, misguided, I think, and everybody was probably guilty of that in somewhat just because the freshness brings back, brings a level of impetus that people will take as a positive. But Where do you think Pep's left in all this, Jim? Because I think his use of personnel at times is terrible. You know, that play call on the interception in the third, and when you had to take a timeout, when you had the timeout, that was your play call. Slow developing route. Only one of the guys gets open against that coverage. Nico's in cut isn't great early in the game, isn't sharp enough, and you know Titus gets walked back by Khalil Mack into his lap. Looks like he takes a bit off the throw, sails it a little, but he's sailing it anyway. But I think there's just the use of personnel is poor at times. If you take away that long run, you know, they only got 56 yards out with that long run, so we're not running the ball well against a team who can't defend the run, and the passing game takes too long to get going, you know, and it's quarters of a time of anemic output. So I suppose it shouldn't be a shock because he was calling plays in a sub-league not so long ago. But I think Pep Hamilton, it might be trust in his players, it might be trust in his quarterback, but it certainly feels like it's very narrow, and it's certainly not giving defenses too many headaches of what they're running. I think it's not helping Davis, but that may be a symptom of his confidence in him. I don't know, but how do you see Pep's future, and what's his sort of confidence levels like in terms of why this offense is incredibly limited?
I think you summed it up pretty well. I think it is a pretty good reflection of what you see on the defensive side of the ball, where it's really hard to gauge where Lovey is, where Pep is as a play caller because of the lack of talent. Overall, though, I think Pep is average at best. He falls somewhere on the average at best to below average spectrum for me as a play caller in the NFL. But look, I think if you look over the course of his career, he's already proven that. He's proven that he can be a quality play caller when he has really good talent. He was fine when he had Andrew Luck in Indy. He had a couple of really good years calling plays. And in the year he didn't have Andrew Luck, he got fired midseason. So, I mean, a play caller who needs good players to call plays to have success, and then when he doesn't have those players to have success calling plays, you're mediocre. You're not really winning games. You're a wash. You're a zero. Maybe doesn't lose games, but not winning them. He doesn't help Davis, and I think that you look at Tim Kelly last year. Tim Kelly put Davis Mills in some positions to have success. The last 5 games that Davis Mills started were much better than the 4 games that we've seen from Davis Mills with Pep Hamilton, and he should be better, right? You expect a year 2 quarterback to be better than what they were in year 1. So some of it does fall on play calling. I think that the team's better around Davis Mills offensively now than it was in his last 5 games last year. Now it's not much better, but you still have Brandon Cooks. You have Laramie Tunsil back, so you should have better protection. You have Damian Pierce, who's a much better running back than what you were getting in the last 5 games last year. So the pieces around Davis Mills, where relative to the NFL, still not very good, but relative to the 5 games that Davis Mills had in 2021 is pretty considerably better. So all of the variables tell you that Davis Mills should be producing better. The only 2 things that you can point to as to why he's not is his own play, which at times he's been erratic, but he's also shown some flashes. And then the play calling. I don't think that it is a system that really elevates Davis Mills. I think Davis Mills is getting frustrated too. If you listen and kind of listen between the lines a little bit from Davis Mills talking about some plays. I mean, yesterday talking about that 4th and 1, we got to pick them up. They just completely whiffed on Khalil Mack, and Davis Mills mentioned that. If you go listen to Davis Mills last Wednesday, he talked about how we got to improve as a scheme. So you can hear Davis Mills doing a little bit of deflecting, which, I don't want to read too much into it, but it doesn't seem like Davis Mills is really enjoying his time with Pep Hamilton calling the plays.
Yeah, and you wonder where that is. I think you've seen frustration in some of the body language as well. So for some of the receivers, when they're not been getting the ball, I think Nico Collins continues to be underserved. He's often open. You could see his reaction when he got that long catch, and certainly, and I think there was an instance the other week there where he sort of threw him short. And you could see the frustration. You've seen that with Brandon Cooks at times, and I think there's obviously something bubbling under the surface there. Whether that's Pep, or if that's just his choice of plays or the way he's managing the guys, I don't know. But it does make you wonder.
Real quick, one of the other things that's real frustrating with Pep too is And this is something that everybody's been talking about. It's the 4th and 1 going with Rex Burkhead, right? Which I mean, if you're going to go with a passing play, I can understand why you're using Rex Burkhead, but you're not selling it because after week 1, Rex Burkhead's had 3 carries. Like when Rex Burkhead's still playing a good amount of snaps. I mean, you can't play Dameon Pierce 100% of the snaps, but you're showing your hand. If Rex Burkhead's in the game right now for the Texans, it's a pass play. And look, I understand that Rex Burkhead's better in pass plays maybe than Dameon Pierce, but you're also telling the defense what you're going to do.
Yeah, no, and I think the best drive was when their second touchdown. Ironically, it was Burkhead that caught it and went to the pylon. But that drive, I think it was about 7 or 8 plays, but just shy 90 yards. But two of the receptions were Dameon Pierce, and one of them was he kept himself up, a great balance at the point of contact, kept himself up, kept you ahead of the chains rather than behind. And it was a good variance running there, and then Pierce picks up the pass, the late linebacker coming in. I think it was Drew Tranquil coming in. Then Jordan Aikens who comes back and looks arguably better than most of your receiving options. Catches another one, takes it in, and then the next play they go to Burkhead, and they are fooled by that. Perhaps they shouldn't have been, but yeah, the most balanced attack or drive of the day was one that was predominantly David Pierce. Now, yeah, you got to keep his workload to a level, but I think the predictability and the utilization of options is poor. I think it was noticeable when Philip Dorsett got in the game late. They started to move the ball better because he's got speed. He requires attention, but again, he's not being used. The matchup of OJ Howard against Derwin James, you were not going to win that, but they kept going back to that. And I just think for the limited, we talked about this last week, but the limited assets you've got, they are nowhere near getting the full utility out of these pass catching options. And I think as long as that continues, Davis and the evaluation will be hindered. And I totally agree, but I don't think he's the answer. I think he's a decent backup type level. I've always thought that. I've never changed my opinion on that. There is flashes, but they just can't be consistent enough. But he will never become more consistent if he's hemmed in by this. We are now saying this, or that is certainly the view for a second scheme and a second play caller, so there's a common denominator there as well.
Yeah. We talked all offseason about to get a fair evaluation of Davis Mills that you needed to keep Laramie Tunsil. You needed to keep Brandon Cooks. You needed to give a certain level of talent around Davis Mills to get a fair observation. Because if you don't, what do you really have? We never really thought we were going to have to discuss that about the offense coordinator position. Like one of the reasons that maybe we're not getting a full, honest evaluation of Davis Mills, and you and I sound like we're on the same boat that, we don't see Davis Mills as, a franchise quarterback. Can he start some games in a pinch? Can he prove us wrong to where maybe he is a top 25 starter in the league? I think he can do that. I'm never going to see him as a quarterback that can lead a team to the playoffs or at least be a scare to every team around the NFL. But I do think that's why we're getting the frustration of Davis Mills, is that he knows how important of a season this is. He knows that this year in a lot of ways is going to define who he is as a quarterback in the NFL. And I think Davis Mills is frustrated that the offense is limiting him. I don't think it's limiting greatness. I think it's limiting a top 25, top 30 quarterback to play below that, to play at a backup standard. And I think that's why he's getting frustrated.
And definitely the bet, and we'll come back to a little bit on that later, but just the Dameon Pierce's performance, big 75-yard touchdown, I think probably the longest one, certainly, but longer than any run they had last year. Last one I can remember was Lamar Miller on Thursday Night Football 2018 against Tennessee, where he took it the full distance. But that was good to see an explosive play. I think Dameon Pierce needed that. He needed to show long speed. He needed to have some form of production because it was starting to become, the longer it goes on, it's talked about, but it starts to become a myth. And I suppose the fear is in this season, when the cupboard's so bare, it's easy to over-glamorize, like we're talking about the coaching staff is always to over-glamorize the talent. I think Jonathan Grenard was the beneficiary of that last year from a defensive point of view. But for Dameon, it was good to see that. how do you assess Damien so far? Obviously, he's getting the most carries, so therefore he's the leading rookie rusher. But how do you characterize his performance and how good do you think his potential is? Because somebody asked me last week, Jeremy, is he a lead back? Is he a three down every? I think he can be over
Yeah.
time. Still not seen it yet. But how do you view Pierce and where do you think he can get to?
There's so few real three down backs now in the NFL. There's not many. Christian McCaffrey. Do you consider Austin Eckler a three down back? He doesn't run between the
No.
tackles as well as a lot of the others. Jonathan Taylor is. I mentioned McCaffrey, but he's hurt a lot. Derrick Henry, you can make the case, isn't a traditional three down back just because he doesn't really catch the ball out of the backfield all that well. Nick Chubb's fantastic. Um, there's not a lot of those guys in the NFL. I don't think that I love Dameon Pierce. I think Dameon Pierce is really good. What's challenging about Dameon Pierce is how many teams are willing to give a rookie running back the second contract.
Yep.
I don't want to look 4 years down the road with Dameon Pierce. I like what he's shown a lot as a rookie. Like you, I was real happy. I didn't think he had that kind of breakaway speed. I thought he was going to get caught on that 75-yard touchdown. So to be able to keep the distance and actually go the full distance was something that was very encouraging to me. I think he's gotten better in the passing game, and like he shouldn't be great at it yet. He's only played 4 games in his NFL career. It's not something that was very, it wasn't a big thing for him at Florida. He had a great block yesterday in pass protection. It's like, okay, this guy's coming around a little bit. They didn't trust him in pass protection in week 1, and now he's picking up some blocks, some blitzes. He's recognizing some blitzes. So I thought that was really good. He had a high number of catches yesterday. They just didn't go for anything. They didn't go for any yards. So kind of unfortunately for him, I don't think he has a choice. Like he has to be the Texans three down back because there's nothing behind him. I think the future's bright for him. I don't know if he's ever going to be a top 5-ish running back. I don't know if he's ever going to be, this new generation running back where he has a ton of catches. I think he's a really good runner of the football. I think he's a really good player to have for the Texans. They got to give him help though. He can't play every snap. And Marlon Mack was supposed to be a guy that was really supposed to be the starter. It'd be great if this team had another running back that could share the workload with Dameon Pierce. Because the thing that I fear is, we see how long's the shelf life for running backs. If running backs start to take a beating, their career trajectory starts to go down. So, like the worry that I have, and I haven't really seen it a whole lot. It seems like the Texans are being responsible with Dameon Pierce, is that he plays 75% of the snaps. Has 25, 30 touches. And by the time you're thinking about bringing him back after his 4-year contract, it's this guy's taking a beating. And why it's frustrating now is because you don't expect to win a whole lot of games. Do you want Dameon Pierce to touch the ball 30 times a week for the entire year and win 3 games? I would argue that's not in the best interest of Dameon Pierce, and it's not in the best interest of the Texans long term.
Yeah, no, I think there's a big element there of they've so chronically mismanaged that position for a second year in a row.
Yeah.
It's just been by sheer luck that you've got a guy in the 4th round who's been better than expected, and you've got a situation whereby you're almost punished himself, or you're punishing yourself and him by running him more than the 15, 20 times a game max that he should be out there. And I think when they ran him late in the game,
Yeah.
when it was done, I just thought like, what this just seems so naive and short sighted. And I think you want Dameon Pierce to be coming into his best form, not even next year, but perhaps the 2024 season where this is likely got a chance to crescendo if things go right. And so many things need to go in their direction for that. But that's when you kind of want it to be there. And and you're right. I mean, you just don't pay these guys because, as you said, I mean, he's already on the injury report last week with a hip, and you think, well, that's not a good sign early doors. So, he'll plug away and he'll not shy away from contact. He'll not shy away from taking carries. But yeah, I think that position and the way in which they've handled it, I think is not fair on him, and why you can't get a guy, if it's Ogunbali or it's a guy off the street who can come in
Yeah.
and just take 10 carries a game just to lighten the load a little bit, from now until the end of the season. That's huge, I think, but it's a worry, definitely.
I mean, you look who they've played too. Just go through the schedule. The Colts have arguably the best running back in the game. He was the best running back coming into the year, and they have a pretty electric change of pace guy behind him in Hines. Denver, and they got some bad news. But when the Texans played them, Javonte Williams is second-year running back that came into the league more decorated than Dameon Pierce and was highly thought of to have a breakout season. But behind him, you have Melvin Gordon, who 3-4 years ago was one of the best running backs in the NFL. Chicago, I was bullish on Herbert even before he went off on the Texans, and like you have David Montgomery, you have Herbert, you got a pretty good little 1-2 punch. And the Chargers are kind of weak with what they have at the running back position. I like Eckler, especially for what they do because he's so dynamic out of the backfield. They brought in Sony Michel to try to be a little bit better between the tackles and things like that. Isaiah Spiller, I'm kind of intrigued about him long term, but not really ready to help. But the Texans should have like two Dameon Pierces. Like,
Yeah.
there's no reason that they shouldn't. Nick Caserio's kind of been limited with draft. I mean, he's only second draft, didn't have a first or second last year. So, the resources haven't been great. And he missed on Marlon Mack. Marlon Mack is supposed to be that guy. Marlon Mack was supposed to be the starter. But Caserio badly missed on him and never even made it to camp, never even made the team. He wasn't on your roster by the time you kicked off the season.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I thought it was good as well, just in the running back theme. I think the Troy Harrison performance was good because there's been a lot of times where he's kind of whiffed on a few blocks of late, and I know he's learned the position, he's converted. Yeah. I mean, everybody knows the story, we've heard it, and it's going to be probably on every broadcast every time he makes a play. But I think it was good to see him from an offensive point of view. But I thought Kenyon Green, that was his worst game to date. Tunsil gave away penalties. Howard went off injured, got bull rushed or not bull rushed, but kind of got a sort of quick inside step from Mack. I don't think Howard's played well this year. AJ Can gave up his fair share. Quesenberry didn't play as well as he did last week. So the whole line, I think, as a whole, didn't necessarily serve all that greatly. The tight end position continues to just be kind of a churn because nobody's kind of healthy. As we said, OJ Howard just didn't match up well against Derwin James. They kept going for him. And the receiver position just doesn't seem to quite, you get Tyler Johnson active, why? If you're not going to give him the ball, or at least, have one or two plays for a guy to say, Tyler, we've got two plays. You're going to be out there for maybe 10, but we've got these two plays schemed up for you. And I think it just comes back to that whole usage of the offense. Just looks sluggish. Now, they did get in with 3 points, and I think at that point you thought, maybe they've got a chance. But as you said, when they just didn't convert the field goal at a big time, got to have it plays. Kenyon Green gets beat by Jerry Tillery through on Mills, and then you end up kicking a field goal. And I think that happened too many times. They had the missed field goal early on as well. So they left too many points, and I think the quality of the offense, the usage of the personnel, the margin of error is so small you can't afford to miss a field goal, not convert from a muffed kickoff from the returner. I think just those three instances alone were just enough to push this team where it is right now out of contention to win the game.
Yeah, the offensive line's a bit curious to me. I thought they've been overall okay through the first 3 weeks. Titus Howard really kind of been a microcosm for his whole career, kind of leaving, much to be desired. And the Texans have already committed a good amount of money for him next year, too, picking up his fifth-year option. You would hope that he would solidify the position. He's been up and down. There's been times where I thought he's looked pretty good and some other times where he's not. Laramie Tunsil. Kenyon Green has been, learning on the fly. I think it's tough for a rookie to be great right out of the gate. Much better run blocker than he is a pass blocker, though. I think that's very evident. To me, the biggest weakness is in why the Texans' offensive line as a whole is probably still below average. And look, Justin Britt's situation probably comes into play here. I think Can and Quesenberry are, just below average. I think that area of the offensive line is the biggest weakness for this offensive line. And if you want to throw Titus Howard into that too, just center, everything right of center. Has been a bit of a struggle. So yeah, that's an area too where you would expect them to be better because you spent a first rounder on Howard, and maybe it's unfair for us to grade Howard as a first round talent, but that offensive line has 3 first rounders on it.
Yeah, it's not living up to expectation. I think Kenyon will learn a lot from the tape. I saw him. His position coach getting in his ear after the penalty, and then he kind of got a sort of a shoving match with one of their defensive linemen as well. And I think it was probably frustration on his part.
Yeah,
I saw Lovey talking about today that he kind of owned up to that, and held his hands up and wasn't where he needed to be. I think he just kind of he sinks down a little bit. He's kind of his pad level kind of almost sort of lunges into the block, and I think it just kind of leaves him when his hands and his feet don't quite match up at the point of attack. I think he seems to get a bit sloppy, and another first round pick, Jerry Tillery. It was a surprise first round pick, but he beat him to the punch a couple of times, and it was a tough day, I think, for the line. And they gave up big plays, and again, the ball security when Davis gets hit, the ball pops out. So there was a lot there not to like. I think on the defensive side of the ball, I thought Petrie, after having a kind of statistically good game last week, was his worst game by some distance. In the run against the pass, he gave the touchdown early. I don't know if it was the change in personnel at the linebackers, but I thought both safeties were all over the place all day, getting caught out and continue to not be able to pass on receivers moving in and out of zones from corner to safety. That seems to be a real struggle for the team.
I think Petrie's a really aggressive player, right? And a lot of times that's one of his greatest strengths, but I thought that the Chargers kind of used that aggression against him,
Yeah.
and they were able to take advantage of that. I think the same can be said for Owens a little bit. Owens can kind of chase those tackles a lot. He came into the game, was leading the league in tackles, I think, right, which is a testament to the linebacking core. But I thought that they were over aggressive. I did, and it led them to being out of position a lot. It led to Austin Eckler having a couple big plays that he shouldn't have. So, that's the negative of having young players that are your best players is that. Look, Bill O'Brien talked about this all the time, right? He didn't like to play rookies. Why didn't he like to play rookies? Because you had moments like this. You had moments like this that lead to huge chunk explosive plays. And that happened to the Texans a lot yesterday. And I thought Petrie was to blame a couple of times.
Yeah, no, I think so. And as you said, you're learning on the fly, and yeah, it will catch you, and you will have off days, and you're reliant on young guys who will, are going to be mistake prone by definition of the amount of snaps they've played at this level. But where do you think, if this slide continues, we've got obviously Jacksonville coming up. If this slide continues, where does it leave? Firstly, the coaching staff. Where do you think that kind of leaves them as a view? Because I mean, it was always an assumption that the general context of how he got hired, and I know some guys were talking about this at the weekend about Cal's interference and fulfilling his father's wish and all this kind of stuff. Certainly, kind of not seeming the most prudent move, but certainly there was no other teams interested. But where does it leave Lovie Smith and his coaching staff? Just say this team only wins 2 or 3 games, which Giants, Washington, maybe a divisional game. That it's hard to see them coming.
We were talking about this on the show today. If you end up with 2, 3 wins and Lovie Smith, who's a defensive minded coach, he's calling your defensive plays. If you have that type of season and you have 30, 31st, 32nd defense in the NFL, I don't know how you can justify bringing him back, especially if you go into the draft and you know that you're going to go rookie quarterback. Because how many teams in the league have a young quarterback, but they also have an offensive-minded head coach with that young quarterback? Justin Herbert might be the exception, right? And the Chargers have been criticized that Staley's not winning enough games with one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Burrow has Taylor. Kyler Murray has Cliff. Trevor Lawrence, they brought in, he had 2 offensive-minded coaches. He had Urban Meyer first, and then they brought in Doug Peterson, of course. Josh Allen's an exception because McDermott's a defensive-minded guy. I think it's going to be very tough to move on from Lovie. I wouldn't bet that they would move on from Lovie. It's going to be almost impossible to do it. But if you go you have to factor in the tie now. If you win 2 games, 3 wins, you're 2-14-1, you're 3-13-1, and your defense is abysmal, I don't know how you could bring him back and look at the rest of your roster with a straight face, especially if it gets worse, especially if you see the unraveling. I mentioned earlier the Davis Mills. I feel like he's getting frustrated with Pep. I haven't noticed that defensively. And look, I think the Texans are still playing hard for Lovie. They came back in that game yesterday, didn't roll over, didn't quit. It's difficult to move on from him. If they win 2 or 3 games and you're drafting a franchise offensive quarterback, I don't know how you can't move on from him.
Yeah, and I think if you, as you said, if you draft a young guy, you really need a head coach who's also the play caller to give you that stability, because then at least those two guys are tied together, and you've not got the possibility of having a successful play calling season and then getting a head coaching job somewhere else. And I think, it's obviously, one, I struggle to see teams that are worse than us.
Yeah.
Really, there's a couple of candidates, but I thought the Bears are one of them, and did we really, at any point, really look markedly better than them? No. Injuries will play its part, form will play its part, but I think there's a very good chance, or probably, how unlikely is it, do you see it right now, as not, being the first pick, or not being the first pick, rather? I mean, it seems pretty stick on, really, from what you've seen. I know things can change, but it's hard to envisage as not being the first overall pick.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that going into last year too, though, and they ended up with the third pick. Now they got off to a better start last year. I've started watching a lot of college quarterbacks because I anticipate the Texans having their pick of the litter. I think that, they're going to have the first pick. You mentioned a couple of games that they could win. I think they're only going to be favored in one more game. I can only see them being favored against Washington. They're not
Yeah.
going to be a favorite on the road against New York. I don't see them being a favorite anywhere else. Jacksonville at home, unless Trevor Lawrence is hurt, I don't think they'll be a favorite in that game.
No. Yeah.
So I've seen some of the computer models that project the Texans to have that top pick, which I'm okay with. I this is a rebuild, and Caserio won't say it's a rebuild, and he talked about, hey, doesn't like that word rebuild, but there's a reason that he didn't trade future picks for the now, right? He's not a fool. I mean, this is very much a rebuild. This roster is going to be in a much better spot in 2023, 2024, 2025. And you mentioned that's the time you hope it all pans out and it all hits, and maybe you can, get back to prominence. I think the Texans I don't think they're going to be a playoff team in 23, but I think they can have a Jacksonville type season that Jacksonville is currently having. Like, I don't think Jacksonville at the end of the day is going to be a playoff team. Maybe they play better than I think and win 9 games and sneak in. But I could see the Texans as soon as next year, if everything falls into place, winning 7, 8, 9 games. Now, a lot has to go right. They have to continue to get development on all of their rookies now. They need to take a step up and play. Nick Caserio needs to have another solid draft class. And you're probably going to need good play from a rookie quarterback, which is almost impossible in the NFL. Even the very best quarterbacks struggle as rookies. So they are probably 2 years away from the earliest playoff window opening up. But I think they can be a much more competitive team as soon as next year. I think it's very likely they have the number 1 pick.
Yeah. And is there any guys out there that have caught your eye? I mean, because it seems difficult, I think, on paper to pass on Will Anderson if you do have that pick, just because, I mean, he can do everything. He's lighter than what you probably want from a 4-man front and love his scheme, but I mean the play just is. Was at 30 odd TFLs last year. He's probably going to track that again this year. There's been some difficult games for Bama, partly for somebody will not mention stalling their offense out, but obviously they've got a quarterback as well. Is there any guys that you've watched you just think, yeah, he's got it?
I like Anderson a lot.
Yeah.
I want a quarterback, but if the Texans drafted Anderson at number 1, I'm not going to be mad at that.
Yeah.
He's just too good of a player. Now, you might need to get creative with how you can aggressively attack a rookie quarterback in this draft. Now, it is a deep draft class. Bryce Young is somebody everybody talks about. I don't know if he's a Nick Caserio guy because of how small he is.
Yeah.
Curious how NFL evaluators are going to look at Bryce Young. He's roughly the same size as Kyler Murray, right? He's probably an inch taller, but probably 20 pounds lighter, somewhere in that range. But Kyler's been okay in the NFL. I think Kyler would be a good NFL quarterback if he was a better decision maker, like we were talking about earlier. And Bryce Young, is kind of the opposite of that, where he's got enough athleticism to move around, but is not looking to just run all the time. And I think his best attribute is his decision making. I like Bryce Young a lot. I just don't see him as an option for Caserio. CJ Stroud's hard to evaluate for me because of what Ohio State does offensively, and they're so efficient offensively. They're doing a lot of RPO stuff, play action, fake the handoff, immediately throwing to a wide open receiver who's 3 yards, a first round wide open receiver who's 3 yards away from any sort of, defender. So he's hard to evaluate. I would be, and Fields scares me. Every Urban Meyer Ohio State quarterback kind of is why I'm scared of Stroud. I'm more scared about that system and that system developing NFL quarterbacks than I am Stroud. Justin Fields is the most recent example. You can look at a lot of the other Ohio State quarterbacks, Haskins, Cardell, Jones. I
Jones, yeah,
remember.
yeah, yeah.
Then you can even go further back. I mean, Day came from an Urban Meyer scheme and system, right? He learned over under Urban Meyer, which is one of the most efficient offensive systems there is in the college game. Urban had Tim Tebow at Florida, great college quarterback, not a good NFL quarterback. The best Urban Meyer, Ryan Day, Ohio State system quarterback was Alex Smith. And Alex Smith, even, I think it's fair to say, was a disappointment as a number one pick. He had a good career, but was he, the first overall pick of a draft? Probably not. So I'm more scared of the system when it comes to evaluating Stroud than I am a Stroud. I think Stroud is a talented quarterback. It just worries me that he has all this talent around him in an offense that makes it very easy in the college game. So that scares me with Stroud. I'd be excited about having him. And then Will Levis is somebody I like a lot who, his college numbers aren't going to stack up to Bryce Young. They're not going to stack up to CJ Stroud, but he's big, which I think Caserio likes. He's athletic enough. He's got a really good arm. He's got a very strong arm, but I also think he's accurate. I think he plays. One of the things I love from college quarterbacks is when they play at a Power 5 program that's not very good, but they elevate that program. I mean, Kentucky going into the Ole Miss game was ranked number 7. Their offensive line's dreadful. I mean, terrible. He's being pressured on every single play, yet they almost go into Ole Miss and they should have won the game. And they had a touchdown called back because he didn't let the line get set, which is on Levis. But I like Will Levis a lot. So any of those 4 prospects I'd be excited about.
Yeah, Levis kind of seems like the most sort of prototypical, tick the boxes, traditionally trained scout in the way that Caserio is. I think that kind of feels like one, maybe, I don't know. I think I can see, you can see him auctioning off that pick because of the potential demand.
Sure.
And still find a way to get a Will Anderson or something like that. I would not, the manoeuvring is certainly something he prides himself upon. So I keep thinking that might be the scenario. But in terms of just where this team is through, 4 games of the greater outlook, how do you view Caserio's role? Because I think, I think it's fair to question him at this point. I know obviously this draft class is still in it, it's in its infancy in terms of its output. Last year's one's kind of fading by the week. Really, yeah. I know it was limited and it was early round picks, but I think when you look at that, plus the free agency, plus the coaching and stuff, plus the fact that we've only got 53 guys on the roster right now because the salary cap's a complete fucking mess, and I think you can't get away from that. Continues to be that. Justin Britt, Reeves Maben, all these bad contracts. On paper, it's hard to. I know it takes time. It's a 3-year evaluation for a GM. I think you've got to give them that as an absolute bare minimum. But as we're sitting here, sort of halfway through that 3 years, there's a lot to point at to say could have been better.
Yeah. I think he talks a better game than the actions, right? Yeah, I mean, when you hear him speak, I mean, he sounds like it instills trust whenever he speaks, which is always a little bit worrisome. I probably lean more on the side of trusting him than not trusting him to get this organization back to the playoffs. But there's some huge red flags now. Rumors of how much was he involved in the David Culley hire? How much was he involved in the Lovie Smith hire? And I understand that. I do get that, respect that. But he's also the one answering the questions to it. He's the one going out in the press conference the next day saying, this is who we hired as the general manager or as the head coach. So as a general manager, no matter how you're getting that head coach, it falls on your shoulders. That's on your resume. So you hired David Culley, who was so inept that you had to fire him at the end of one season. That's on you. You hire Lovie Smith, who it's fair to question that the game has passed him up. He hasn't had a winning season in the NFL since 2012. It's not going to have another winning season this year in the NFL. And you hired him without ever really being one of the candidates. Was there external circumstances that led to that hire? Yeah, but you also signed off on it. You're the one answering the questions about Lovie Smith being your head coach. So from a coaching perspective and hiring the coaches, it's probably 0 for 2. It's at least 0 for 1 with the jury still being out, and probably 0 for 2. Some of the trades last year I thought were trivial. Trading 6th-round pick for Ryan Finley. never makes it to camp. What are you
Yeah.
doing? A fifth rounder for Anthony Miller. You cut him a week later. There was a corner, I think, from Green Bay. You traded a sixth rounder for, and he gets cut the next week. You're just giving away late round draft picks. And look, late round draft picks, whatever, but I'd rather have those late round draft picks than not have the players on the roster that you traded those late round draft picks for. So that's a red flag, albeit a small red flag. It's still troublesome. Some of the free agents have been fine. They've been limited on what they can do because of the cap situation that you mentioned. I think Caserio's done a pretty good job of getting the cap in a good place next year to where they're in a position to strike and go out and try to find some free agents that could be part of the rebuild. The draft, like you said, it's probably too early to call. Last year's draft looked better on opening day than it does now. I still think Davis Mills, drafting him in the third round. If you have a third round quarterback that is starting games for you the next year, that's probably a hit. I don't know if that's necessarily a miss. Nico's fine. Roy Lopez is struggling, but you found him in the sixth round. That's fine. This year's draft, it looks like you've had some pretty good hits. And again, 4 games in, the jury's still out. Unconventional, though, right? Kenyon Green, a guard in the middle of the first round, unconventional. I think Kenyon Green's a good player, but unconventional. Jalen Petrie looks like a hit in the second. Unfortunately, we won't see Mechie this year. We haven't seen Harris yet. I like those picks on draft day, although you can question the trade up, right? How much value are you losing by trading up the few times that Caserio has done that? I like Derek Stingley. I think Derek Stingley is going to be good. It's unconventional to take a cornerback at number 3 with some of these playmakers that went after him at the wide receiver position. One of my biggest fears with the 2022 draft from a Caserio perspective and a Texans perspective is that one of these receivers that was drafted after Stingley, whether it's Wilson, Olave, whatever receiver, if that guy turns into Justin Jefferson or if that guy turns into Jamar Chase, you drafted a corner over both of those guys. So that's unconventional. A lot of times can be fine if it works, but some unconventional thinking when it doesn't work, it's going to be questioned later.
Yeah, there was the late touchdown when they beat Cleveland the other week for the Jets, and Wilson, albeit it was catching balls from Joe Flacco, but yeah, there was just something about that just looked elite.
Yeah.
And you have to put them in that environment and that scenario to see if they really got it, because obviously there's 101 guys that look great in college, but maybe only 10 pan out of the pros or whatever the statistics is probably closer to a quarter. But I think it just there's potential there. I think it wasn't a great draft class. You're hoping this one's going to be a bit deeper. Just the COVID and everything, trying to super seniors knocking it all off. I think we're now finally out of that. Obviously the salary cap, I think we're sort of shy of 50 million, but only 37 players under contract, so they're not going to be lavish, certainly in his spin. I don't think Casero will ever operate like that, but at some point he needs to start signing free agents who you think, he's a guy we'd like to keep around, and it might not be a big role in the team, but I don't think we've attracted enough of those, and part of that will be by the position we've been in. But it's difficult, but it's an ongoing evaluation. It's easy to kind of, I suppose, that you've only really got the bigger picture because the here and now is shy of where it needs to be competitive, and I think that's for sure. But do you see the Jacksonville game prior to the bye, Jeremy? Is that a chance to win a game, or have they improved enough under that new coaching staff that's kind of ignited Trevor Lawrence?
I mean, it's winnable in the sense that every game in the NFL is winnable. I think Jacksonville is much improved. I think Jacksonville might be one of the more improved teams in the league. Rookie quarterbacks going into their second season, you start to see a much bigger leap. The best thing that could happen for Trevor Lawrence is they brought in Doug Peterson there. Doug Peterson had Carson Wentz playing at an MVP level, and he had Nick Foles beat Tom Brady in a Super Bowl. Doug Peterson can coach. That was a godsend for Trevor Lawrence. They have a 1-2 punch at running back. Didn't play well against the Eagles because the Eagles have a really good defense. But they have a legit 1-2 punch. A lot of people criticized the money spent on Christian Kirk, and maybe he is overpaid. But even if he's overpaid, he's a good receiver. So they have some talent there. Both of the Jones, Zay Jones, Marvin Jones, and their defense. I mean, Trevon Walker's looked pretty good so far. So he was an element that they didn't have last year. I think Jacksonville is much better. I don't think the Texans are going to win a game this year unless another opponent plays poorly. They give them the game. They turn the ball over. So I I mean, that's how I would envision a scenario where the Texans go into Jacksonville and win is if you force Trevor Lawrence. I think he turned it over 4 times yesterday. He fumbled it
Yeah,
4 times.
yeah,
Like you're gonna have to force him into multiple turnovers. You're gonna need multiple turnovers, and you're gonna have to, you know, not turn it over. I know it's cliche, but Davis Mills is gonna have to play a little bit better. If you're going to win a game down the, he's going to have to win a game in the fourth quarter. He hadn't been able to do that. He's had chances and hasn't been able to do that. He's been dreadfully bad in the fourth quarter. So that's really the recipe. I mean, it's a team that's not going to be as talented as anybody they play. So they're going to need an opponent to play down to their level, and they're going to have to be able to capitalize in big moments. And they haven't done that yet.
yeah. When you think they completely shut down that Chargers offense that tore through us with a level of regularity in the first quarter alone, coupled with the fact that if they hadn't started fumbling in the rain against the early form NFC team and the Eagles, then I think there's not a huge case to be made. I think when you're talking about Doug Peterson there, though, I think like that was an option we could have had, and you got to remember he was not Jacksonville's first choice. It wasn't until the deal didn't go through and their number one candidate that and Byron Leftwich that they went there. But as you said, proven track record of improving guys, and he's a great guy that you'd like. You're talking about drafting a quarterback next year. Perfect coach for it. So yeah, it kind of makes you question that grander picture again. I think when you look at Jacksonville, and I think when you look at Detroit, I think when you look at and obviously with the vested interest in the draft pick, when you see Atlanta winning at home against, it was a field goal fest. But when you see them winning against the Browns, you see these teams have progressed. In Drake London, I wasn't a fan of him, and I was on the record saying that. But he looks like he's going to be a good pro. When you see these teams progressing, it kind of feels like they're doing it a bit quicker and a bit more prudently than we are. And I think, you've got to always hold yourself up to the standard of the league, not just your own bubble, because it's easy to get lost in that. But I think that there's definitely feels a sense of these teams are piecing it together a little bit quicker than we are.
Yeah. I guess to defend Casario, they had a year leg up on you, right? The Texans were in the playoffs a little bit more recently, I would imagine, than some of those. I mean, Texans aren't that far removed from the playoffs.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe. And then you didn't have your first and your second because of the damage of Bill O'Brien. So, like, in a lot of ways, this is your first true year of the rebuild. Whereas, Atlanta's had a year up on you, Jacksonville's had a year up on you, Detroit's probably had 14 years up on you in their rebuild. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of a dire state. Just you kind of appreciate that Lovie Smith has them playing hard. You appreciate that you do have some foundational pieces on this year's team, whereas last year you didn't. I don't know how we made it through last year. I mean, what was the foundational piece on last year's team? So maybe the arrow's trending up, but it's still a very long way to go, I think is a fair way to say it. Although things change fast in the NFL. I could see a scenario where the Texans, get to 6, 7, 8 wins next year. It's going to take a lot of things to happen right, but things can change fast.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I think it's 1 week at a time, and you'll see hopefully Stingley's arm's okay, bit of friendly fire catching him, and then he landed on it, and then he was in and out of the game at a brace. So hopefully that's okay, because you want him to play as many snaps and touch when he needs to be healthy, because that was the reason why, he didn't go, one overall, because his 2019 tape definitely justified it. But health has been the big detractor. And as you said, Kenyon Green's always going to be compared to the guys around, and Zion Johnson was over the other side of the field, looked pretty solid. So I think you certainly didn't see him blowing up any pass sets. So albeit at right guard. So yeah, there's a lot to be decided when you got these picks coming. There is a catalyst for change. We're not sitting rudderless like we have, or it felt like we were rudderless in years prior. But yeah, there's a lot to go in our favour, and I think Jacksonville was always going to be quite an inflection point for us. How much had they improved would historically continue to sweep them. And I wonder, Jeremy, in a week's time, how do you think the sentiment will be of people? Because we were not touched on it, but Allen was out there with the helmet on, warming up the arm. It was very close to Mills getting benched. If you're then looking up at Jacksonville when you didn't even think that was possible last year, now Lawrence always was bubbling under the surface because you can see the elite traits there. But I think the sentiment will take a big shift towards not a good place if you go and you get turned over by Jacksonville because one, people aren't used to that,
Yeah.
and two, it's maybe a bit of a reminder of how far there is to go.
I think you're starting to hear a little bit of that. It's only been 4 games, and you're starting to hear, oh, should the Texans be making a change in offense coordinator at the end of the year? Yeah, it'd be really hard to move on from Lovie Smith after 1 year, but you might have to move on from Lovie Smith after 1 year. So you're starting to hear some of that, and I think the momentum of that would continue to pick up some steam, especially if you're losing to Jacksonville, because you're right. Jacksonville, if you just look at the name, you should at least be competitive or beat Jacksonville. So I think you could start to see a little bit of that if it does happen. Um, I'm curious too to see how the Texans respond after this, because this was their worst game defensively. It was the best offense they played by far, but their worst game defensively. I want to see how they respond. I want to see how that defense looks. Lovey talked earlier about the Kyle Allen thing too, and he doubled down on Davis Mills. Like, look, Davis Mills is our starter, so we'll see.
Yeah, and just having that bye early, if you go to Jacksonville, don't look competitive. You
Yep.
then come out with a trip to Vegas, and a team that was kind of just hovering above you. You could lose that one quite comfortably based on how well they've played on the road in the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, longer than that, really. The Bill O'Brien era was riddled with poor performances on the road. Then you play Tennessee, and then you got a Thursday, and you got a short week against the Eagles, so you could easily lose the next four.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go 8 games without a win, particularly when you got the bye week early, that almost hampers your ability to make a lot of changes, change coordinator, change positions, change quarterback, whatever it might be. It's difficult to kind of see any kind of beyond that back-to-back games in New York and Washington just because of the perceived strength of your opponent, but it was the same for Chicago. It's hard to see them kind of getting some stimulus, and I think that's probably going to be the concern for everybody in the building right now.
Yeah, it's going to be like you start to lose teams at that point too, right? You start
Yeah,
0-6. Oh, well, they have the tie. But if you start winless in 6, if you start winless in 7, you start winless in 8. That's when you start to kind of lose the locker room. I haven't seen any signs of that. I think yesterday's game is an example of the opposite of that, where you're down big early and you still had the fight, you still had the effort. And look, Lovey's very positive with them. I think it's by design because I don't think you'd be that positive with a team that you expected more out of. Usually you're positive with teams you don't have much expectation for, and I think that's what's leading to Lovey's over the top, positiveness.
yeah,
I don't know if like changes can really like who else can call plays offensively. I'm not sure we've seen any of these other guys call plays offensively. I'd have to go back and look at it. I also don't see the point.
no,
This is 2022 so much about answering questions that you have about certain players and certain guys. Um, One of the thoughts I had earlier today too is, look, Lovey's not a young guy. I wonder if at any point Lovey would entertain, I'm gonna go hang out with the family a little bit more. I'm gonna maybe retire at the end of this season. Like, I wonder if that ever creeps into the mind of Lovey. Lovey's a real competitive guy. I mean, I'm sure that he's not going to want 2-14-1 to be his last year on his resume. But at the end of the day, that's week in, week out of media abuse and trying to scheme up a defense with talent that can't win you a lot of football games. I wonder if that ever enters the mind of Lovey by the end of the year.
yeah. It's funny you say that because I think in terms of the media stuff, because I think there's a couple of new faces in that room
Mm-hmm.
this year, and certainly there's been a lot more kind of direct question and a lot kind of more
Sure.
probing and follow ups and stuff like that this year that you've definitely seen that. And I noticed somebody referenced it and they said, oh, it didn't need to be like that after week one. But ultimately, you threw away a chance to win a game that might have been your only win of this season. And I think there's definitely when you can feel that. I think there's always a kind of inflection point or a point of passing on the frustration because ultimately people get frustrated talking about the same stuff. I certainly am. I'm looking forward to the
Yep.
bye week. Usually we'll do college prospects this year. I'll just be taking a break because it's quite hard. It's difficult. And you guys are on the radio every day or whatever, and it's for a few hours and trying to piece that together. Obviously, we're lucky we've got teams that are competent, and a team that has shown the real sign of growth in the Rockets, and a team that might win a championship. That you can balance it out with, but
Mm-hmm.
it's it's a level of you can feel that bubbling because it's tough, and you realize in of these cities in Cleveland, Detroit, like you mentioned earlier, how that contempt and that frustration and that just general dismay and disillusionment and disenfranchise of the fan base can happen. You can see that. And it was boos to almost rolling out a backup quarterback in a year that was meant to be, silver platter handed to a guy who arguably earned it last year. I don't think he necessarily has earned the chance that he's been given. So it's not necessarily taking a direction of growth, and until you see that and you see the real material progress each Sunday, it felt like that a little bit week one, but you then coughed up a tie, which feels like it seems worse with every passing moment. But yeah, I think until we get to that point, Jerry, where it's real progress and people feel like, right, I can see the direction on the field and off the field, it's going to be testy, I think.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of times people want that progress to be in wins, and a lot of times it doesn't have to be. Davis Mills could play a really good game in defeat, and you could see that progress. Derek Stingley. I thought Jalen Petrie a good example of this. Jalen Petrie played a really good game in Chicago, at least statistically in defeat. You can kind of look at that as a positive and somebody that you can count on in the future. You kind of almost have to recondition your mind on how to watch this football team. Because if you're watching this football team to win a lot of games in 2022, you're going to be very frustrated. It's just
Yeah.
a realistic viewpoint of where the Texans are. Could they win 3 or 4? Sure. Could they win a couple in a row and then a couple in a row and somehow get to 5? Maybe. But that seems like the very the absolute optimal amount of wins they can get. So you almost have to change your viewpoint on how you're watching this team, and kind of keep in the back of your mind that help is coming. You have 2 first rounders in 23. You have your full allotment of picks. Same thing in 24. 2 first rounders, full allotment in picks. You mentioned the salary cap space, but only to a certain amount of players, and you can't really have be big fish, or big game hunting. But you have help on the way. Like, can they go out and spend all that money on a Christian Kirk to come in and help the offense? No. Can they have the spending spree of Jacksonville? No. But there should be help. There should be a couple of starters that you sign in free agency. There's going to be a couple of starters that you bring up in the draft. So, like, my viewpoint of 2022 when I watch the Texans is like, am I pulling for them in the heat of the battle and in the games? Yeah, I want to see Davis Mills have a game-winning drive. I wanted them to hang on and beat the Colts when they were up 20-3. I want to see Davis Mills prove me wrong. I think a more realistic viewpoint, though, is you see, you watch Davis Mills and you're making your own evaluation if you think he's the guy. You watch Derek Stingley Jr. and you watch him to see if he was worth the number 3 pick. So you almost have to rethink of how you watch the games and kind of look at it from a little bit of is that kind of a depressing way to watch the games? Yeah, maybe, because you're not rooting for a team who has playoff contention, and it's the NFL, and we all love the NFL and want the local team to be competitive. But I don't think you can look at it like that from a realistic point of view.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think and I've got absolutely no problem with having the first overall pick because it makes it interesting, and I think it gives you a hope that you can find a guy. But we know it doesn't always work out that way, and
Sure.
that's it's always in the back of your mind. But yeah, it was interesting. You saw that about the fad. I think it was Parker McCollum, the country music singer, tweeting about how the Texans are. He's almost kind of washed with them. But it's almost people that aren't in touch, I suppose, with the real kind
Yeah.
of pulse of the franchise and where it is. That it's not going to happen right now, and it's a process.
Mhm.
So we'll see. But Jeremy, thank you very much for your time. Any last words before we shoot out here?
No, I think that you should just kind of temper the expectations on what you think of the Texans in 2022. Know that help's on the way, and be excited about the future. I do think that the Texans have a promising future. Now, Nick Casario needs to hit on draft picks, but they have capital going down the road. They have this year's draft class. They have the picks coming up in the future too. That I think you can see a path where this team gets back to playing significant games late in the season within the next couple of years. And I think there are better days ahead for Texans fans.
Yeah, trust the process. More change to come. It will be the only constant, but yeah, hopefully we get back to a point where we can start talking about coming back into games and making it worthwhile, not just being ever so close. But thanks to Jeremy for his time. Thanks for everybody listening again this week. Like, share, give us a comment on Facebook, share the podcast where you can. Help us growing this year as we're in year 4, grinding it out with you every week. Hopefully it helps you make some more sense of it, and we'll be back next week before the bye for a final time. Take a rest after that, but we'll talk Jacksonville next week with you. But thanks again for listening, and we'll speak to you again next week.